All right, so in this lecture, I want to say a little bit about evaluating sources of information. And this is actually another one that's really hard. Your book has the last few pages on this. And honestly, I struggle with whether to say anything about this at all because it's hard to say much in a short period, right? It's one of those things that's almost like you either need to, part of me says you either need to skip it or spend like 2 or 3 weeks on it, if not more. But, I do think we can say a few useful things about it, sum up what your book says, and also just say a few more, right? So, any controversial claim you make in an argument requires either an argument to support it or that you cite a source, right? Sometimes this source will be an authority. Um, we talked about, how that works last lecture. But a lot of times it will be a news source, right? Someone who claims this or that happened or is happening, right? But not just any source will do. And I think this is important because not just, that we're going to need this to support our premises and our arguments, but just in day-to-day life, a lot of the information we have to rely on information that we get secondhand from other sources. You know, even people who don't like the media will rely on some source. It will just be something else, right? Anyway, a lot of what I'm going to say here mostly applies to the news media, but I think it applies to all sources of information. We've already talked about experts, but what about other claims, that's not like some specialized claim? So one thing I'll say is to be aware of the political slant or even agenda of every source. And I don't say bias for a few reasons. Your book talks about bias. People refer to bias pretty easily. I think this is not right. I think this is not fair. Some sources are openly biased. But a lot of times, I think bias, we have this image of people being deliberately unfair. I think a lot of times when people have a political slant or agenda, they're not being unfair, they're not trying to fool you. It just means that they see the world in a certain way, right? And we all see the world in a certain way. We all have a preconceived notion, right? Let me give you guys an example of something kind of innocent. I remember one time when I was a kid, I was in town with my uncle. We're going to this diner to get some breakfast, you know, and we run into this woman from church that I was actually pretty fond of. I thought she was a really nice lady, right? My uncle hated her guts. Or at least, maybe didn't hate her guts, but at least didn't like her, was having an argument with her, right? We see her, and, I speak, she doesn't stop. I am a little louder. To me, she looks very distracted. She looks like she's in a hurry. I feel bad for even like pushing it the second time, but she says, "Oh, hey, Sam," you know, and goes on. And my uncle's like, "Did you see that? She saw us and didn't want to talk to us, and she didn't speak to me because she doesn't like me." My uncle's perspective was that this was a deliberate slight. My perspective was, well, I don't think she saw us because she was in a hurry. I don't know who was right. I tend to think I was. But, given if you knew us and when you knew what we thought of this person, it was kind of predictable how we would interpret it, right? Neither one of us is lying. Neither one of us is trying to get you to believe something false about this woman. We just have different feelings about her, different expectations of how she behaves. We see the same situation differently. The same goes with a lot of news sources. They're not trying to fool you. They're not trying to be unfair. Just if you're a conservative, you probably see the world one way. If you're a liberal, you see it another. You interpret things differently. Now, to say somebody has a political slant or even agenda doesn't mean the source is unreliable. It certainly doesn't mean they're lying to you. It doesn't even mean they're unreliable. But I think it does mean that they see the world in a certain way, and you need to take account of this, right? Try to figure out, if you're reading a newspaper or watching a TV show or whatever, figure out the political slant of it and take account of that as you think about the information they give you. And think about this when you use them to support premises in an argument. Ideally, you can always cite more than one source, right? And ideally, you can cite sources with different political views, right? If you cite a conservative newspaper and a liberal newspaper to support some claim, they both say this happened, that's pretty darn good evidence that it happened. As a larger thing, as your reading points out, it's not a bad idea to have a so-called varied media diet, right? Try to read different news sources with different political views and values, take account of them. Another thing is to know your own political views and values, be honest about them, and know how they affect how you process information, right? If you say that you don't have any views or values, you are either the most apathetic, ill-informed person I've ever met, or you're lying to me and yourself, right? You do, and that's not a problem. That's not wrong. But be honest with yourself what they are and take them into account in the way you see the world and interpret things. And know that it is very difficult to be fair. We tend to be not nearly as critical as we should be of views we agree with. We tend to be way too critical of views and claims we don't agree with. When you're making an argument, if it's a premise that you agree with, but you know it's controversial, be very careful, give the other side a hearing, provide extra support for this. What looks like good support to you might not really be, because you are primed to accept it more easily than you should. Keep these tendencies in mind and correct for them. Give more scrutiny to views or claims you're inclined to agree with. And on the other side of it, be charitable to views you don't agree with. Always be sure that you're fair to views you don't agree with. Try to give them the best evidence possible. Again, think of the principle of charity. This is really important here. Even play devil's advocate, see if you can make a good argument for them, right? Thinking about, possibilities in an argument, take seriously views you don't agree with. If you want to rule them out, take time, give evidence to actually rule them out. And I know this is all kind of a whirlwind, but I will say it's often very hard to figure out what is true. It's hard, not in the sense that, gymnastics or figure skating or something is hard, that running a 4-minute mile is hard, most people can't do it. It's hard in that it's a lot of work. And it's work that is often uncomfortable because it requires being very skeptical of our own views, being very critical, and making a lot of effort to be fair to people we don't agree with. But you can often do it if you try, So anyway, I know that's a whirlwind, but I think it is kind of important to say this stuff. Not going to say too much about, the content of arguments, so we're going to stop here. But I think it's important to say just a little bit about it, even in a logic class, even though logic is mostly about the structure.